So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this event. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Georgina Stewart, who is not only my very good friend and colleague, but a superb Māori philosopher and educator. Georgina has a background in maths and science. She is the Associate Professor in Te Kura Mātauranga School of Education at Auckland University of Technology. That's in Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Her research focuses on the intersections between knowledge, culture and education, including Māori science education, biculturalism, bilingualism, and Māori and Indigenous philosophies. Georgina has just completed a Marsden-funded project, Marsden is like our SHIRT projects, to investigate the use of Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, in the academy. She is co-editor-in-chief of the New Zealand Journal of Educational Studies, associate editor of the Journal of the Royal Society of New Zealand and Educational Philosophy and Theory, and on the editorial board of Curriculum Matters. Nā reira, Georgina, tino hari, tino koa. Nau mai haere mai ki te whare wānanga o Alberta, kei runga I te whenua o Papa's Chase First Nation, me te tiriti 6 hoki, nā reira. Tēnei te mihi kia koe. Kia ora.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koe mākere mo tō mihi, tēnā koutou hoki ki ngā tangata whenua o tēnei whenua. I'm pleased to be here and thank you all very much for coming. So I'm going to start with showing you a little bit of few visuals of where I come from and telling you a little bit about myself and my background. So this view that you're looking at here is the view from my father's house. I know there's a lot of stunning scenery in your country as well, but this is just about as good as it gets in anywhere really. This is my abstract, so I'm going to talk about Indigenous philosophies and explore their potential for schools, universities and society. I'm referencing the term Kansas, which is an acronym meaning Canada, Australia, New Zealand and US. It's a grouping that is a useful way to think about these 4 countries as having similar education systems that are really ultimately based on the British system. But in these 4 countries are what we would call settler countries, in which there is a relationship between settler, Anglo populations and the Indigenous populations. In each of these countries there's a definite gap, ethnicity gap, whereby Indigenous students achieve relatively poorly compared with the national rates of achievement in education. And this is really due mainly to lower literacy and numeracy for Indigenous students, but in New Zealand an extra gap for Māori students is attributed to a sense of cultural alienation in schools. Māori education has passed through several phases since its origins in the early contact days. Most recently with the emergence of the Kura Kaupapa Māori or Māori language schools, Māori medium education, and I've been involved in that since 1993. Sort of started off with preschools in the late 70s, where grandmothers in particular, who were native speakers of the Māori language, were placed in preschool environments where they were speaking to the little children. And the idea was that they could bridge those generations that had lost the language. And then when those children reached the age of 5, there was the need to go on and establish schools so that they didn't lose the language that they'd gained. So I'm going to say a few words now. This is the sort of introduction part of my talk. And this is designed to be somewhat light-hearted. It's the website, or the URL, that's the YouTube video that's referenced there, is a tourist video using one of our well-known comedians, Rhys Darby, and it was sort of catalysed by the discovery that IKEA was selling world maps, where there was just a blue space off to the east of Australia, no New Zealand there at all. This This image shows you, well, on the left is sort of more what we're used to thinking of as a map of New Zealand. Consists of two main land masses, the North Island and the South Island. Those are the names of them. Very original, yes. And the little island there at the bottom is Stewart Island, but no relation to me. But the image on the right-hand side shows you the way that the land masses are thought in Māori thinking, with the North Island being called in Māori the fish of Maui, and the South Island the waka or canoe of Maui, and Stewart Island is known in Māori terms as the anchor. And the point I'm making here is really that sometimes Indigenous thinking and ways of looking at the world can appear to be upside down to dominant Eurocentric views. And this image, just randomly, I take a lot of the images that I use in my PowerPoints are just off the internet, so I don't claim any ownership to them. But this is a useful one because the land is oriented in Māori terms, but the words are the right way up for us to read, and the place names are some of the major place names that still remain Māori place names. So coming back now to the northern part of the North Island, this is where I come from, and in particular this little place that's labelled on the map as Matodi Bay. That's where the shot that I showed you at the beginning is taken. Here's an aerial view of the beach from Google, and up the top of the hill here is the little village, and right at the end here is actually where my father's house is. And this is a snapshot that I took on that grass where I just pointed the pointer. And I've always liked this photo, this family snapshot, given the sort of the concentration on the delicious roe of the sea urchin that they're using the teaspoons to scoop out. So that's my father, that's my brother, and two nephews, taken some years ago, I might add. So extending on from that, I come from a bi-ethnic family. Both of my parents had both Pākehā and Māori heritage. My father had one Pākehā ancestor, or white. Now, I'm going to use this term Pākehā. It is the Māori term for white New Zealander. So that's just to get that clear. And his surname was Stewart. So that's where my surname comes from. And my father grew up in a Māori-speaking household, and like many people in his generation, didn't learn or begin to learn English until he went to school. He told me that he was given the supeljack, and the supeljack is a thick forest vine that grows in the bush, and the teachers would cut lengths of that and hit the children, the Māori children, if they heard them saying a word or two, even to their siblings, in the language that they all spoke at home. And my mother, on the other hand, had only one Māori ancestress, going back 5 generations in the matrilineal line. She was one of the first students back in the early 50s. She was learning Latin in a rural school, and hearing Māori still being spoken as a community language around her. So she petitioned the board of the school that she should be able to learn Māori, and they acceded to that request and brought in a local elder to teach her. So she was one of the first senior school students to learn Māori as a subject, and she, on the basis of her school results, was able to get a scholarship and go to university. So I left, when I left school, I enrolled in a science degree. I grew up really loving nature as well as reading. Those were my 2 primary passions, and probably still are today. I was particularly enamoured with the idea of saving the takahe, which is a native flightless bird. You probably know about the kiwi, which is a flightless bird of New Zealand. We have a number of them, and the takahe was considered extinct until it was rediscovered in mountainous parts of the South Island. But I found that I couldn't draw, so I didn't get very good marks for dissections. I didn't like that anyway, but I enjoyed the kind of learning particularly the chemical reactions of life of biochemistry. So I went on and did a Masters in Chemistry, a Masters of Science in Chemistry, and then following that worked for a while in Cancer Research Lab, where I really started to question the sort of orthodox models of health and well-being, and eventually left the city and went to live up where my dad came from, and that's where I kind of started to extend what I had earlier learnt as a child of the Māori language, and then after about a decade went back to train as a teacher, and then after about a decade of teaching, during which time I was the inaugural teacher of maths and science through the Māori language at one of the first, well I think the first secondary or high school that was teaching through the medium, through the classroom medium of Māori language. And it was that real life experience that brought me to my doctoral studies of wanting the chance to explore why it was so difficult to teach science through the Māori language. And I completed my doctorate in 2007 and was appointed to my first academic position at the University of Auckland in 2010. And in 2016, I moved university to Auckland University of Technology. So I went from the biggest, oldest university in the country to the smallest, youngest university in the country. AUT is a millennial university. It was only turned into a university in the year 2000, and it's doing well in the world rankings in that particular category. This is my grandmother, my father's mother, Tangiara Nui. She never learnt to speak English. She was born in about 1900 and died in 1981, and despite all those decades of the radio and in-laws, speaking English around her, really never learnt more than a few words of English. This is the old woman is her oldest daughter, who passed away, born in 1919 and passed away in about 2015. And I was inspired to record an interview with her a few years before her death when I asked her about her life as a child, and she told me some amazing stories. And that's one of my sister's mokopuna grandchildren, who in Māori terms is really also my grandchild. And this is me getting capped in 2007 with my doctoral degree, and I just wanted to show you the image of the kiwi feather cloak that I'm wearing. It's a family treasure. It's pre-European. I took it to the Māori fibre expert at the National Museum in Wellington, and she laid it out on her table and read it like a text. It was amazing. She told me it was made in the old pre-European style and technology, and in about 1880 she estimated its age. So it actually is museum worthy, and it now is in a case. We've put it to bed. This is from a newspaper article that was done with me and my mother at home learning astronomy, and this is a poem. This is one of the most well-known poems that my mother published about the muka, which is the fibre this is the stone pounder that they use, because this is a picture of the flax tree or harakeke, which is a really culturally significant plant in Māori society and Māori culture, not only because it was used to make rope and nets and all of those kinds of things, but also it was seen as a metaphor for mankind. So, and this is a kete or kit that has been made with the harakeke. Yeah, I sort of initially thought that I would read this out, but I think I'll just move along, because what I'd like to do now to finish off this introduction section is to run a short video, a 4-minute video, and it's a good video, although there is a bit of Māori spoken in it, but I think it will still communicate its essence to you. So I just pressed, oh that's right. Okay, and this one.
Tēnā koutou katoa, e hautu nei I tēnei kaupapa, ka rua e kawe nei I tēnei kaupapa, e whakahokia mai nei tēnei tāunga o te pōki te ao maranga, tēnā koutou katoa.
can remember there wasn't any woman on this marae that had their kauai done.
Tēnei kaupapa, te mokopapa, te mokauai, te mataora, he tino taonga nā tātou, te taenga mai o te pāpira, te taenga mai o te paipira, I weku ai nei tuahuatanga.
My whā tupuna who wore moko kauai just inspired me to one day follow their path.
I understand different whānau, different rohe, different iwi have their own whakaaro e pāna ki tēnei huarahi. Right, Paiana, for us here at Ngāti Tara, this is the beginning of our own revival of mātauranga. You know, we have to take our own leadership. This is part of the journey for us. Kia hau nei, my probably biggest wero was I am going to be representing our whakapapa, and I'll be in other environments in taiao where I'll be around wahine and whānau who have that whakaaro. But again, pai ana hau nā te mea kei konei au, ka tūranga waiwahi.
I'm not hidden, they walk. You can't infiltrate no more, girlfriend. Infiltration.
I just felt loved. Yeah, I just felt loved. I felt I could feel the wairua within the room. I could feel aroha. I could hear different voices. I loved your singing. All around the room you could hear and connect with people, and it just, yeah, you could feel just love. I believe there are other wahine in there, and our whānui who start thinking, yeah, ko au tēnei, and that plants seeds. It's awesome just to be part of that revival of our mātauranga. And look, whānau, I have to say, it also is for me, nā te mea, titiro kia hau, e tino kiri māhau, and just that absolute feeling of I'm not hidden anymore. Just, and it, you know, and it brings a whole, it just,
I just wish that there was more of my family here to share this.
Well, I'm hoping that this will become a normal thing for our whānau here. I'm hoping that this kaupapa has planted a seed in our wahine toa here, and they can go away and start preparing for their moko kauai. You know, things are going to get better in the future for our tamariki, for my nieces also to come after me, because I'm not the first and I won't be the last. Normalising moko kauai.
Ki oki nei whakaaro, he kaupapa tino rawe, tino tauke o mātou rangatahi me ngā mokopuna hoki hara mai I tēnei rā. Kia whakahoki a mai he tikanga tuku iho ki runga I tō tatau nei marae nei tēnei rā.
Ngā mihi ani karo, hope you see this, and love you long time.
Okay, so I think it's important to start with these key concepts of race, ethnicity and culture. And in particular the notion of race, and it's a word that I never use without using the scare quotes around it. It is a concept that was ejected from the lexicon of science at least 50 years ago, because it began, its meaning is about dividing humanity into biologically separate groups, which is clearly inaccurate and invalid, because all human beings belong to one species, bearing in mind that the biological definition of a species is of a group of organisms who can reproduce. So we're all one species, but there are obviously political reasons behind the concept of race, and in particular behind its perpetuation today. So ethnicity is, sometimes people have said to me that ethnicity is just a more politically correct or PC term for race, but that's not the case. And the definition of ethnicity is of something that happens when two very different cultures come into contact. And I'd like to give you the example of Māori that I've been already talking about to you. Because before contact with European, the word Māori was not used as an identity label. It comes from traditional Māori language where it was used with a small m to mean ordinary. And the classic example of its use was in terms of water, or wai. So wai Māori was fresh water, drinkable water. Wai tai was salt water. And if you imagine living in a society that does not have Daimo label makers and having, you know, different containers of water, that it would be important to make that distinction. So before contact with Europeans, different tribal groups identified themselves as coming from particular localities and identified themselves by their kinship or tribal groups. And even today, if I'm talking to a Māori person, we will very quickly get down to that level in asking about each other's identity. So Māori really was Māori is an example of an ethnicity term. It's like an umbrella label for all of those people, and it arose out of the trauma of contact with the European invaders. The term Māori with a capital M was first started to be used as an identity label in about 1850, whereas culture belongs within the groups. And culture is, culture is used in different ways, but in sort of sociological or social scientific terms, culture is a complex set of characteristics, and it varies from things that are visible, like material culture, but it also includes things that are invisible, like philosophies and social norms. And sometimes I have had the experience of speaking to white friends who have, one in particular I'm thinking of, where we went to a conference in Fiji, and later she spent time in a sort of a village, and she spoke to me afterwards and said she was disappointed to find that they had none of their culture left. And the reason why she made that observation was because the housing was used European materials like corrugated iron, and the clothing that they wore was woven fabric. But that's an example where culture is being understood only at that very surface level. So building on from those points about these three important concepts, I think it's important to note that what is usually termed multicultural or bicultural in education is actually more accurately termed bi-ethnic or multi-ethnic. Because, for example, in New Zealand, when a school has approximately equal numbers of Māori and Pākehā students, it will just commonly be called bicultural. But in actual fact, the school still runs according to the traditional mainstream European-derived ways of operating. So more accurately, one should call that kind of school a bi-ethnic school. Another thing that happens in New Zealand is that there is an exaggeration made between the difference between bicultural and multicultural. And my response to that, sometimes, like for example, people will say, well, why are we talking about bicultural? Because in New Zealand terms, bicultural is always talking about the relationship between Māori, the Indigenous, and Pākehā, the settler. And people will say, well, we're a multicultural society now. Our society includes lots of people from more what we sometimes call New Zealanders. For example, at the present time, there's been a big influx of immigrants from India. But this is really a kind of one of those Eurocentric tricks, because biculturalism and multiculturalism are both aligned. There's no conflict between them. The struggle is really to break open the framework of monoculturalism that is so strongly held around education. And another thing that sometimes one sees in the literature is people that argue that if there is no such thing as the concept of race, then that must mean that racism doesn't exist. And that is clearly a false logic. So in terms of education and Indigenous students, New Zealand, you have to understand that New Zealand has always wanted to aspire to an egalitarianism. It's a very strong part of our culture, the idea of giving someone a fair go. And equity policy in education is seen as a key tool to work towards equality, social equality. But there is a permanent statistical gap for Indigenous students, and that's representative of this ethnic inequity. And I would point out too that achievement statistics don't tell the whole story of inequity, because they omit the students who leave school before they get to the point of sitting qualifications, school qualifications in the senior school. And here's a shocking statistic that only 5% of Māori boys remain at school until the end of the final year of school. So I wanted to just show you a visual image of how ethnic inequity is represented. And these are graphs that were made on the basis of data collected in a very large project about 10 years ago. And so this was data for the whole country. So this is definitely quantitative data. And the EE is everybody else, and MP stands for Māori and Pacific. So the difference in the heights of these columns show you the difference in the inequity between white and brown, really. See, this is where the reason why the older students, the results don't look so inequitous, but that is because, as I said, there are very, very few Māori left at school by the time you get to this level. Well, and I should say, of the Māori students still at school in the final year, very, very few of them are in science and maths subjects. So here's another representation, and I'm sure this is, I assume this is something that you're all familiar with, is the standard curve, where this is the mathematically sort of neutral kind of curve, the red one in the middle, where the average is at the highest point, and there's a symmetrical sort of dropping off on either side, where the horizontal axis would represent achievement from low to high, and the vertical axis really represents the number of students represented under the height of the graph. And New Zealand has a long brown tail of achievement, which means that in any time this kind of graph for education is produced, the results are not sort of statistically neutral. There is still a relatively high average achievement in international terms, but there is this long tail on the side of low achievement, and the students who are represented under this part of the graph are overwhelmingly of Māori and Pacific ethnicity. And it's interesting, I had to use this kind of generic graph because these statistics, it's very, very difficult to find the stats in this form in the public domain. So it's that kind of almost that burying of bad news that we unfortunately are faced with today. So this kind of inequity is not how New Zealand wants to perceive itself. Not only is there a pride in fairness and the idea that education is how people can work their way up, that kind of idea of social mobility. But also New Zealand has, for a long time, ever since the Second World War actually, had a reputation for having the best race relations in the world. The Second World War, the relevance of that is the significant victories that were enabled by the Māori Battalion. So when the Māori Battalion came home from the war, they were greeted as heroes, only to find that their land in the meantime had been taken away and given to white farmers. So, as I was sort of been saying, schools are seen as the vehicle for this kind of egalitarianism. But decades of policy interventions have not closed these gaps. And there are downstream effects such as teacher expectations, and I'm giving the reference there to some of the best work, or the only work really, that's been looking at specifically focusing on this notion of teacher expectations, where teachers in these studies are shown to have very low expectations of Māori students, and that meaning irrespective of the actual achievement of the student, they automatically assume that a Māori student will achieve poorly. probably a bit the same as because I'm Māori, my work is just generally assumed to be of poor quality. So currently we're in an age of neoliberal policy in education, and this continues the assimilationist direction of the past eras, where the problem is located with the student, and the problems have shifted from the biological or racial level, which is seen as no longer appropriate, but now it's shifted to the individual parent choices as being to blame for why Māori children achieve poorly. So here's a recent cartoon from a newspaper showing this kind of idea. Given the rampant growth and inequality, many Māori children are now living in poverty, and in response there has been this big growth in the provision of food at school for hungry children. And this cartoonist is saying that Māori parents are trying to make the school responsible for feeding, well, in this case, in the cartoon here, not just their kids, but also themselves, trying to trick the school into getting a feed there, because what they're spending their money on is alcohol, cigarettes, and gambling. So this is this kind of blame the victim idea that is unfortunately quite rampant. So, but the point, and this is what is not acknowledged, is that Pākehā wealth comes at the expense of Māori poverty. So there is this very strong social amnesia amongst white New Zealand about how the nation state was established by means of not only military power, but also unfair dealings and outright trickery, outright cheating. In the early days of contact, the balance of power favoured Māori. The tribes, the iwi, welcomed Pākehā to come and live in their village because they were very interested in getting hold of European technologies, in particular literacy. And it's estimated that at some point in the late 1800s, more Māori were literate than Pākehā in New Zealand. Of course, that reflected the fact that there wasn't a very large Pākehā population, and a lot of the Pākehā that were there were sailors and whalers and sealers, and not necessarily have people with that kind of literate background. But by 1900, the balance of power drastically changed, and Māori were expected to assimilate or die. But even then, the Pākehā population was mostly urban, and the Māori population remained mostly rural. And that meant that up until 1960, in rural communities, Māori still spoke Māori. And in fact, Māori have been bilingual since first contact, which is something that's not often taken into account. Nowadays, it's considered quite cool for Pākehā to learn Māori. And one professor, one very well-known sociolinguistic in New Zealand, wrote in his most famous book that until recently, New Zealand was a monolingual country, and only recently becoming bilingual. But I thought that really displayed a lack of taking into account of the Māori perspective, since Māori had always been bilingual. And partly due to the fact that Māori continued to have their land alienated after the war, there was the need, they were forced to go to the cities in search of work and employment, and took up really that proletariat role of manual labour and so forth. And the Māori urbanisation is one of the fastest urbanisations of any population anywhere. And more recently, mechanisation, particularly of the primary industries like farming and forestry, which are very big income earners in my country, since we don't have much in the way of, we don't have oil, we don't have gold and those sorts of things. So we have, Pākehā have built their wealth on the backs of a very fertile land and a very gentle climate, very suitable for sheep. You probably know that, one of the jokes about New Zealand is that there's 20 sheep for every person. And also, in even more recent times, since about 1990, the offshoring of all of our manufacturing to countries where labour costs are cheaper. So these are more recent moves that have taken a particularly large toll on Māori people, and these are the historical precedents of current Māori poverty. So Māori education, because of these I've been trying to kind of paint a bit of a big picture, is a bit of an obsession in New Zealand. One of the reasons why schools feel a particular responsibility to address Māori inequality is because of the role they played, as I was talking about in my personal introduction, of disrupting Māori culture and language in the first place. But you know, and I'm sure it's the same here, schools are being asked to deal with the resulting problems from these long-term macro-level social and economic processes. And you know, I've thought about why the government, from the government's point of view, why they are committed to funding Māori education and Māori language schools. And it seems to me that there are two things. First of all, Māori is a very well-known Indigenous culture around the world. It would be a very bad look for any government to be the government under whose watch the Māori language and culture completely died out. Second of all, Brand New Zealand, if you understand what I mean by that, has found Māori culture and language extremely useful, and it would not be good for Brand New Zealand not to have that ongoing knowledge of Māori language and culture. And I'm sure those of you who have Indigenous links here could make that same kind of critique. So Māori language schooling keeps the language alive, but it also acts as a nucleus of social and cultural regeneration. For instance, Māori parents, for the first time since the very early days, now that they're much more likely to want to come to the school and be involved in the education of their children when the school has a Māori identity. So I was interested to present a few ideas about the nexus between knowledge, education and politics. First of all, that knowledge production is dependent on subjectivity, which in turn depends upon the social practice called education. And education is universally seen as a beneficial force for people, for good in people's lives. And this is sometimes called the Immaculate Conception ideology of education. Nobody that I speak to disagrees that it's good for their kids to have education. But this ideology allows education to maintain and at the same time hide its real nature and what drives it. And it's important to note here that education has no ontological status. In other words, it's not a natural thing. It is a social process, and it is therefore always already political. So I'm going to present a few ideas based on these two important readings from Cliff Fulke, a chapter called Education and War, Primary Constituents of the Contemporary World System, and it's in the book whose cover page is shown there in the image. And also a very interesting paper by a very interesting author, David Graeber. One of his best known books is called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. But this particular paper that I'm drawing on is an article in the online open access journal called HO, Journal of Ethnographic Theory. So capitalism traces back to the English Enclosures Act, whereby land was reconstituted as private property between about 1400 and 1800. And at the same time, the person was reconfigured and it was the beginnings of the idea of the individual, the human being as an individual. Education plays a key role in maintaining our notions of the human being, both at personal and at national levels. And what I mean by that is, you know that one of the most important roles of schooling is socialisation. It's where children really figure out who they are and how and what part they play. And schooling contributes greatly to the national imaginary. But education currently is in the grip of business and therefore subject to presentism, reductionism, universalism and profiteering by the already rich. So capitalism and war. the models of realisation of capitalism have passed through these three stages: pre-industrial, industrial and post-industrial, each with their own forms of subjectivity as well as forms of the state, forms of war, forms of education and forms of technology. So if we look at the military-industrial complex of globalised power, in the Cold War, the research university itself proved to be the greatest war weapon ever invented. And that statement is borne out if we look at the history of technologies, war technologies, and the beneficial effects that war has on technological growth. War promotes technological change. So education became modernised and industrialised and started to take the form in which we understand it. Here I'm talking in particular about schooling, following the Industrial Revolution. Still, it's perceived as a pastoral process that cannot but be indiscriminately beneficial, even though the mutually determining relationships between knowledge production, education, empire and war have been evident in every developed jurisdiction for at least a century. We can think here too of the influences of things like the testing movement, which of course is something that was developed in the military and then applied to schooling. Other things such as programmed instruction, educational technology, this kind of nexus really between technology, capitalism and schooling. So education and war, during the Cold War, spending on education greatly increased, and this was really the turning point was the Sputnik, when the Russians managed for the first time to escape the force of gravity, caused a very great reaction, particularly in the US, and that reaction really was about using education to try and increase international competitiveness. So military and corporate interests combined currently control most high-cost knowledge production in universities, though often in ways which are not immediately evident. So education produces subjectivities and in turn is produced by reality. Once subject to the interests, these are the big power bases. Once was the church, then it became the state, now it's the post-military industrial capital. It is the educated who are most susceptible to propaganda, given that it works by manipulation of the symbolic realm. So the formation of credulity is a passive form of education. Psychology, that developed in the late 1920s as a discipline, was applied to the waging of psychic war as propaganda, and in the civil realm that was renamed advertising. So we can think of advertising as a kind of psychic form of war. And psychology, of course, has been fundamental in education for nearly 100 years. No prizes if you're guessing that I'm not an educational psychologist. So interpretive labour, there's a sociological rule that holds that less powerful groups in any social setting are obliged to carefully study and know and understand the powerful groups, but not the reverse. And this rule is definitely seems to apply in New Zealand, where Pākehā fail to understand Māori points of view, whereas Māori have schemata of working knowledge about the ways of Pākehā. And there's a particular battle in the 1800s called Ruapekapeka, where Māori, the English assaulted using cannons and basically just bombed the heck out of this hillside pā. But unbeknownst to them, the Māori soldiers inside had dug pits and were hiding below the surface of the earth. And when the Pākehā decided that all the Māori must be dead, they stormed the pā and were cut down by the soldiers. And the Wash Day at the Pā controversy, which I don't think I'll have time to talk about today. But these are famous examples when Māori kind of prevailed over Pākehā, and the point about it is that they are based on Pākehā misunderstanding of how Māori think. So structural violence, and what is called structural violence, it's important to recognise, is always underpinned by actual violence, the threat of physical harm. And violence, it's interesting that makes the point that, Graeber makes the point that violence is one of the things that has the most predictable effect on humans. And that sort of sounds like a weird thing to say, but the point is that, you know, in conversation or in any kind of any kind of interaction, person-to-person interaction, if we treat the other person as a subject and respect for their bodily integrity, then we can never quite be sure what the effect of our interaction will be. But in that sense, violence, you know what the effect of violence will be if you impose it on another human being. And structural violence is kind of enacted by the mechanisms by which society is rendered inhuman and also stupid. So, for example, the more that groups in a society are subject to sort of rules of structural violence, the less actual understanding there tends to be. And Graeber points out that both bureaucracy and social theory rely on oversimplification of the kind of infinite complexities of human-human interaction. So from that point of view, we are complicit as academics. Now, research is a technology of war, and an example here is the DARPA, which stands for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the US, which was formed in response to Sputnik, and that was the group that started to develop the internet. Currently, whatever it has now kind of become, is currently leading in robotics and artificial intelligence. And we're at the point now where we're close to the possibility of technologically displacing the educated human being. The logic of war that drives capitalism will eventually make education obsolete. And it's my guess that perhaps we're starting to see this in the withering away of support for strong, fully funded, state-provided public schools and universities. So given that the global dominance of Western knowledge and this kind of almost, it seems like, unstoppable and inevitable drive towards this kind of post-humanity where human beings in general, you know, and en masse, becoming obsolete, there has been hope that Indigenous knowledge may provide possible alternative forms of knowledge with possibilities for alternative futures. But what does Indigenous knowledge actually mean? I see the term Indigenous as a placeholder term, the way that we use zero in maths as a placeholder, because it doesn't actually mean anything in and of itself. To call someone Indigenous is not to know anything specific about them. So again, it's like an umbrella label, but on a very large term. So for instance, I am representing myself on this visit as an Indigenous scholar, but that doesn't mean I know anything about any other Indigenous groups, such as the Indigenous peoples of this place. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm particularly interested in that either, because that's their culture, it's not my culture. So that's the sense in which I'm saying it has no positive content. And that's important because education policy tries to simplify the complexities of culture. It tries to group people into categories. And in doing that, there's a danger of not recognising that these categories may not actually have any meaning. But all we can say about Indigenous, about what Indigenous means and indigeneity, is that Indigenous peoples are place-based ethnic cultures. They are not settler cultures, they're not colonial cultures, they're not migrant cultures, and they're not diasporic cultures. So you can't, that's why I say there's no positive content in the term. We can really only talk about it in terms of what it isn't. But its usefulness has really been in terms of forming a binary with Western. So it means something like non-Western, and we can think about its links to earlier anthropological terms like primitive, man, native, the anthropological singular, the native, as if that was a sort of a set biological natural category. So Western and Indigenous both operate, these two terms operate as what I call a reified binary, where, I mean, the term Western, you must, when you really think about that term, west of what? You know, it's also in danger of becoming a kind of a term, an umbrella term that means something, but it's really hard to pin down what it actually means. But sometimes that binary is used for strategic purposes by Indigenous. And as I've been sort of saying, explaining the meanings of words and concepts in this kind of space can often be political as much as epistemic. So Indigenous knowledge in the academy, and the edifices of science have studied all aspects of Indigenous knowledge and culture since they first came in contact. And I'm thinking here in particular of the voyages of discovery that followed the Enlightenment and the outgrowth of Western science and technology. And as you probably know, two key inventions were necessary in order for Europeans to sail around the world, colonising and gathering and examining and researching other cultures. And that was the clockwork mechanism and the lens. And those two technologies, those two inventions combined, allowed ships to sail out of sight of land and know where they were. But the exclusion of Indigenous knowledge, well, I mean, hang on, I was just going to say that when you think about it, the very term anthropology, which was one of the original social sciences, means the study of man. But what it really meant in its original formulation was the study by Europeans of other cultures. But the exclusion of Indigenous knowledge has been an integral part of the boundary making process that has defined the disciplines and defined and brought into being the modern academy as we know it today. So if that's the case, then logically it is no simple matter to simply include Indigenous knowledge in the curriculum. So the kind of the switch from being the subject or the topic of research to being the Indigenous researcher brings in ontology. And this is why I use Māori philosophy and I've found this a particularly useful lens to reread historical debates in education. And it's like a rescue project whereby I have rehabilitated Indigenous concepts. I have reread Eurocentric social science for Indigenous purposes. So thinking about worldview and epistemological diversity, since languages encapsulate cultural worldviews, it has occurred to me that Indigenous languages probably reflect cultures operating with a different balance between left and right brain modes of thought. I'm thinking here about the growth of the scientific genre of English, English being the dominant global language, and particularly in science. English is now the global language of science. And with that growth of science, that has impacted on English itself. So it's been a kind of a two-way influence. To the point where English, in particular scientific English, represents the domination of the left brain at the expense of the right brain. And I think this is probably part of what I'm thinking about at the moment about the history of the division of writing between literature and science, which arguably is a false division. Whereas Māori, Te Reo Māori, for example, is in many ways is so different, a language that's so different from English, and one of the ways in which we can express that difference is perhaps in terms of a different balance between left brain and right brain ways of speaking. So the strength of this model is that it supports both a coherent notion of epistemological difference between Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge, but it also shows their connection because all human beings have a left brain and a right brain. It's part of our biological heritage. So it avoids that awkwardness of it's almost a racist thing to think about Indigenous knowledge or as being somehow different, or Indigenous languages as being of a different nature. So I was looking, I like the development of this model as showing how there is a difference, but it's not a total qualitative difference. It also shows or explains why, and it's something that all of us who work in cross-cultural contexts know, that there are Indigenous concepts and words that do not equate to any single word in English, where the paragraph, the narrative or the metaphor is required to encapsulate the meaning of an Indigenous word. But it helps to explain that feeling that Māori and probably other Indigenous people have of living in two worlds. I think of it more as living in two world views, and perhaps also helps to explain the alienation of Indigenous students from high school. So the question of whether or not Māori knowledge is science or is us science or anti-science is really more of a question about how we're understanding the word science. And the claim that Māori knowledge is a science or is equal or the same as science is really more of a political claim than an epistemological claim. And in my view, the real value of Māori knowledge lies in it being different from science, so that we can actually look for an alternative way of understanding the world and our place in it. So I've been interested in thinking about this difference for a long time. And it seems to me that the most important differences between Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge lie at the philosophical level. And what is often a mistake that is often seen is to compare, shall we say, the empirical fact base of Western science with the values of Indigenous knowledge. And that's not a fair comparison, right? So I was interested in looking at comparing, say, Indigenous or Māori philosophies with Western philosophies of knowledge. And it seems to me that one key difference lies in the two very different ways of understanding the relationship between human beings and the natural world. Because in Māori philosophy, human beings are seen as kin, as related to all other living and non-living elements of the natural world, and extending up as far as Papatuanuku, the Māori word for earth, but also the Māori word for Mother Earth, or the earth deity, the female earth deity. Because in Māori terms, for instance, the forest, there is a god of the forest, Tāne Mahuta, but the forest is also an embodiment of the god. So it's that kind of, it's not like this is the forest and this is the god. They are more or less one and the same. So, but whereas if you look at Western knowledge, and I'm thinking here of Heidegger and the question concerning technology, where he sort of drilled down to the essence of Western views of technology, which I think are also relate to Western views of knowledge and science, as the natural world forming this kind of standing reserve. In other words, sort of like a supermarket of resources that humans can use and consume at their will. So that kind of, that's just such a different way of looking at how humans relate to the natural world, that I think it has a lot of potential for overturning the way that we think about natural resources and the natural world. So I use Indigenous philosophy as an ontological framework for rethinking Indigenous concepts and histories that have been really subject to Eurocentric misanalysis, and also as a frame of reference by which all Indigenous traditions seem to share. And that leads me to the conclusion that it's actually the global Euro-American culture that is abnormal or out of sync. But there are dilemmas with Indigenous philosophy. Do we aim to bring Indigenous philosophies further into the light, the enlightenment of the Western Academy? Or is it to argue that Indigenous philosophies, that there is this infinite deferral or incommensurability? Are we delineating a modified form of philosophy, understood in its unmarked sense as inherently Western? Or are we pointing to this kind of difference that cannot be reconciled? These are questions that I'm still pondering. So I'm not sure. I have more to talk about. In particular, I have a sort of typology of cultural responsiveness. Is that something that people would be interested in? And can I keep going?
How's that? Yeah.
I don't know what the time is, because that says it's 7:10. I'm pretty sure it's not 7:10. It's 3:08. Shall I keep going for a bit?
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in this, and can I say that? I am here, especially the early childhood curriculum in New Zealand that claims to be bicultural?
Well, it's not only the early childhood that claim.
And I don't know about K to 12. But
Right.
I'm more familiar with that.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Well, I can speak to that a little bit. Okay. So, and yes, I think you'll find this part of the talk of particular interest. For over 30 years since the bringing in of neoliberal education policy, there has at the same time been this kind of purported aspiration to assist Indigenous Māori students through the use of bicultural policy. But again, you can see the scare quotes around that term. And this was really based on an astonishing policy by the New Zealand Treasury in 1987. Astonishing because it was the first time in a very that the Treasury, who look after the money, right, of New Zealand, saw fit to provide the government with very detailed directives about education policy. And in that, in this particular document, there was one chapter on Māori education, and in that chapter, it was actually really insulting to educationists because it basically dismissed a lot of educational research. And yet, interestingly, it picked up on this one idea for which there was no evidence, that the reason why Māori students were failing was caused by their low self-esteem, caused by the exclusion of Māori culture from schools. And I find that politically significant because it was a way of putting the blame back onto the Māori students themselves. So that was the beginnings of a phase of bicultural education policy. I describe it as, not only me, but others as well, such as this paper by my colleague Megan Lowry in an international journal of education policy, describe this as a smokescreen and part of a politics of distraction away from the fact of inequity of wealth, because it's been reliably shown that educational achievement is proportionate, I should say, to family income. There's really no grounds for doubting the strong relationship between family income and educational achievement. So since Māori families are concentrated in the lower rungs of wealth in New Zealand, it's inevitable that there will be an ethnic inequity in education outcomes. And the thing is, from a Māori perspective, the problem with Pākehā taking up ideas of biculturalism is that they want the partnership to begin from the status quo after 200 or more years of oppression, unfair dealings and marginalisation. So we have this conundrum of Māori education policy. Neoliberalism, which ideas of neoliberalism underpin contemporary policy, and those include this tendency towards presentism, this inability to understand how history influences and really creates the present, and the reductionism that looks for simple, preferably measurable explanations. So this kind of thinking adds on to the existing social amnesia, which is promulgated by schooling. I mean, I remember when I was 10 being told that there were no full-blood Māori left alive, even though I knew perfectly well that my grandmother was still alive and she was known to have no Pākehā ancestry. But, you know, when you're 10, you kind of accept what the teachers tell you. So Māori advice to the government has always been for teachers to better understand their Māori students. But in the presence of this white amnesia, that advice has been misinterpreted to meaning that Māori culture needs to be included in the school, rather than, I think, when Māori say you need to understand your Māori students, what they're saying is you need to understand the history, that why these Māori students, who they are today, is because of the history. I heard a policy analyst last year summarise the discussion that we had been having by saying that the whole of the Māori world must be included in schools. And it made my blood run cold, really, because of the way, that kind of symbolic annihilation, that the kind of the failure that Pākehā routinely demonstrate to understand that the Māori world is its own world. It sits outside of the Pākehā world. But that kind of like that domestication of thinking that you can bring the whole of the Māori world into the school program. So what I'm going to run through now are 5 versions of cultural responsiveness that have been that reflect common practices in of New Zealand teachers as approaches towards this cultural responsive pedagogy. And each of them have strengths and weaknesses, so I'm not trying to say that there is one right answer here. So the first one is the use of cultural imagery, and teachers can and do use Māori words or Pacific words, names, iconography, artwork, etc. in the classroom and their lessons and so forth. And it's certainly appropriate to reflect the different cultures that you are teaching or in the nation and the physical environment of the school. Sometimes this kind of practice is called tokenism, and that's a fair comment in the case of a teacher who may do this but nothing else. The second level would be cultural incorporation, including cultural practices in the school life. It does allow for richer or more authentic forms of cultural responsiveness, but we have to understand the limitations due to the loss of the original cultural context of the social meaning, function and agency. For example, in New Zealand, Māori elders are often wheeled in, as it were, you know, it's called diala kaumata or diala porphyry, to lead a school welcome. So for that moment, they are the leaders, they're in charge, but nobody is under any illusion that they have any real power in the school. So that's an example of they're just kind of wheeled in, used for that moment, hopefully given more than just a sandwich and a cup of tea afterwards, but not always. Sort of as if we do this just because we do it. And we do because Māori are usually generous about sharing their culture. The third form that I've seen a lot with teachers is what I call cultural blindness, whereby they say, I treat all my students the same. And I understand that for teachers, for white teachers, this is a thoughtful, ethical decision based on the wish to see each student as an individual and to foster a democratic learning environment in the classroom. The problem with this approach is that it ignores the fact that students are not on a level playing field. So a pedagogy based on cultural blindness is unable to critique and therefore helps to maintain existing patterns of privilege and disadvantage. The fourth version of cultural responsiveness I label cultural brokerage. It's kind of the opposite, so these are in two pairs of 2 so far. It's a bit like the opposite of cultural blindness, where it risks overemphasising culture, and I think that's what the Treasury was doing with the inauguration of bicultural education policy, trying to see all inequity as resulting from culture or its lack thereof. And this easily succumbs to a form of deficit theory by which Māori students are subject to a double deficit, not only underachieving in terms of the curricular knowledge, but also in terms of their culture. So teachers will sometimes be critical of Māori students for not knowing their own cultural background, which of course ignores the fact that Māori for generations have been not only encouraged but pretty much forced to abandon language, culture and identity. And the fifth form is what I label cultural systems, and I use this as a label for those schools that I was talking, like the ones I was talking about earlier, where the lingua franca of the classroom is the Māori language. So these are school settings with a Māori or Pacific identity. They can sometimes be whole schools, but sometimes they are just one classroom or a unit of several classrooms within a mainstream school. But sometimes they'll be called like the whānau class, or which means family, or the bilingual class, or the bilingual unit, or the immersion unit, operating within a standard school, but within that space, the parents that choose for their students to be taught in those classrooms are choosing for their child to be identified and treated as a cultural being. And the aim of this kind of school school program is to try and overcome any disjunction between the culture of the school and the home. And I think this is the deepest level of cultural responsiveness. It's at the structural or systemic level. So culture is not a rule-bound set of practices. What is right in one setting may not work in another. What's important is to make the ongoing effort to see each occasion, each time that culture comes up, to see it from the perspective of the other. And I think the simple rule is always to keep in mind that it's the interests of the student that should be at the centre. It involves doing what's in the heart. It's not a checklist kind of a thing. It's not something that we can, put into it. It's not something that you can be trained in. You have to undergo, sometimes the teachers, white teachers, have to undergo a very challenging kind of subjective encounter with difference. Sometimes involves a lot of tears or self-searching. But teaching is a kind of a work that involves not just the head but also the heart. So I think of cultural responsiveness as a journey where the price of a ticket is a positive attitude, an open mind, and really importantly, a tolerance for the discomfort of travel. But I also will critique cultural responsiveness. What's happened here? Well, I'll just carry on for a minute while hopefully the slides are brought back up. I'm critical of the whole idea of culturally responsive pedagogy because it seems to me to amount to nothing more than what we would consider good teaching practice. Surely it stands to reason that as teachers we should always acknowledge and respect the cultures of the children that we teach. And I've never really seen anything in the culturally responsive literature that goes beyond respect and acknowledge. So for me, it's not really, it's not anything over and above that. But the latest move in policy in New Zealand, I mean, 30 years, well, it's nearly 40 years now, really, of so-called bicultural education policy has not closed the gaps. In fact, under the rampant growth and inequality, these gaps are getting bigger. Of course, they're bound to. We now have a homelessness problem in my country that did not exist until about 10 years ago. We now have a quarter of Māori children living in poverty, or what is now more politically correctly called food insecurity. So rather than admit that this policy direction has A, not been sincere, and B, is not working, it's like we're forced to go further and further down in that direction. And just recently, the change that's been made is that teachers, every teacher in the country, as part of their ongoing professional registration, will be required to demonstrate how they are using and developing their knowledge of te reo Māori in the classroom. And I just find that so difficult. Should we go to the big screen? Don't worry about the slide, but just go to the slideshow view. Yep. Sorry about that. No, it's all right. Okay, what was I saying? It's the teachers in New Zealand are overwhelmingly Pākehā white and have little or no reo or Māori language. So this is becoming a really kind of scary thing that's coming for them, and also for those of us like myself who work in schools of education where teacher education is, we are now being extremely challenged to provide lessons or, courses in Māori and teach our teachers to become confident in te reo. So it's unworkable, but I struggle, and I just don't see the logic. How will teachers learning Māori help Māori students achieve better in English subjects? Because we're not talking here about the schools where the Māori language is the classroom language. We're talking about the vast majority of schools that are English medium. So it seems to me to be based on a completely illogical premise. And and thirdly, although I believe that there is a great deal of scope for the enrichment of the curriculum using Māori culture, I'm not sure that it's helpful when teachers are forced to teach anything. That would seem to be at odds with the idea of best teaching practice.
Sorry, your memory key. I'll just load it on the computer here. Sorry, folks. Technical difficulties.
Because I can't remember what comes next. As if. But while I'm waiting, maybe I can say a few comments about the sort of the way that curriculum development has gone. I myself have been involved since 1993 in curriculum development for science. So there's a dual curriculum document. Our national curriculum consists of two partner documents, one written in English and one written in Māori. So there's a school curriculum that covers the whole age group from 5 years to, because most kids start at school. Well, what you call K to 12, we call 1 to 13. But there is a curriculum that covers all subjects at all of those levels, written in Māori. But whether or not it's different, how different it is perhaps a moot point. Right, it does, doesn't it? And okay, so that's what I just finished saying. Okay, let me just finish this, and then we can come to a discussion and talk a bit more about the early childhood curriculum. So this is just sort of as an Indigenous scholar reflecting on how Indigenous academics can easily become brokers of the Western desire to romanticise, appropriate, characterise or depoliticise Indigenous knowledge, hence participating in those lopsided structures of imagination that support the bureaucratic filtering structures of violence, which in turn protect our own privilege as university scholars. And this kind of complicity is often seen in the expectations placed on Indigenous academics, such as Māori scholars, who are often expected, at the request of their white colleagues, to organise a cultural welcome or cultural elements for a conference and so forth. So education is a political football in a democratic society such as the Kansas countries, where schools are expected to solve more and more social problems, yet run along business lines. And yet there is still this kind of idea that education can change the future. Indigenous philosophies align with the earth against the rapacious logic of capitalism. And Indigenous philosophies offer us an approach and a sort of a way of thinking about how traditional curriculum frameworks can be enriched with Indigenous knowledge. And I believe that Indigenous philosophy frameworks are vital to Indigenous education practice and research. And my point there really is that good Indigenous education research that does not think about the philosophies of research will often succumb to domestication. And back home is the final slide, thank you. So maybe I could just pick up on the bicultural early childhood curriculum. It was, the new version of it was mandated, came into use within the last 12 months.
2017.
Right. Okay, time's flying. So it basically consists of 2 books, sort of 2 halves that can be read, one in English, one written in Māori. The differences are, you know, the question of whether or not it's a translation is a fairly moot point. There are some slight differences in the strands, and those can be significant, because I would say that even very small changes in the curriculum of a classroom can make an enormous difference for Indigenous students. Yeah, but then I think the sort of the dilemmas and the questions that I've asked, you know, is this just kind of bringing more and more Māori knowledge into the kind of Western curriculum frameworks? And I'm also mindful that curriculum is itself a product of the Eurocentric approach to organising knowledge. So that does undermine the coherence of a notion of an Indigenous curriculum. So I'll leave my answer to your question at that point.